Today, the question is there a double standard in the response to anti-Semitism against Arab Americans as compared with the response to anti-Semitism against Jewish Americans?
Our first debater is James Zogby, founder and president of the Arab American Institute and author of Arab Voices. Mr. Zogby.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you, Ralph. Thank you, Andy, for hosting this. I want to begin by trying to frame the discussion, if I could, and I do so in the following way. Historically, the animus that inspired bigotry directed at Arabs and Muslims on the one side and Jews on the other side has been cut with the same cloth. This is a largely Western phenomenon directed against two Semitic peoples, one which the West found living in its midst and therefore defined as an internal threat, and the other which the West confronted as an external challenge, but which is similarly defined as a threat to its survival. In some ways, these two anti-Semitisms were no different than any other racial or tribal conflict, except in a matter of degrees. Both Jews and Arab and Muslims were perceived as threats. Their organization, their wealth, even their corporate identities was viewed as threatening to the West. As a result, both groups suffered vilification and dehumanization, and both have endured systematic and persistent campaigns of intense violence. Jews in history were segregated and tormented and targeted and forced to endure repeated pogroms leading to the horrors of the Holocaust. The dehumanization campaigns against the Arabs, on the other hand, were used to justify imperial conquest, the colonization of Arab lands, and efforts to eradicate their identity in the Maghreb and the dismemberment and dispersal of their people in the Levant. 3 decades ago, I collaborated in a study of political cartoons and other forms of popular culture, comparing the depiction of Jews in Tsarist Russia and pre-Nazi Germany with those of Arabs that were contemporary in the United States. In both content and form, the treatments given to each of the two groups were virtually identical. The two most prevalent depictions of Jews in the German and Russian treatment parallel the two most common images of Arabs depicted in the United States cartoons. There was the fat Jewish banker or merchant. He found his counterpart in the obese oil sheikh. And the image of the Jewish anarchist, subversive, communist terrorist morphed now into the Arab or the Muslim terrorist. They differed only in attire. Facial features and the rest were the same. Both were alien, and both were hostile. They were accused of not sharing Western values, of being prone to conspiracy, of being lecherous usurpers of our wealth, and therefore threats to Western civilization. Jews were portrayed as internally associated with capitalist greed and externally with foreign threats to our security and our way of life. Arab avarice, on the other hand, was responsible for our economic decline. They too were seen involved in conspiracy and associated with an external source that was threatening to our security and our way of life. What we're discussing here today is the sad but true fact that while it has become unacceptable to politically express or manifest bigotry against Jews, anti-Semitism against Arabs, and increasingly, by extension, Muslims, remains a part of our popular culture and our political discourse. We're not here to debate Israeli policies or practices or the reactions to them, however wrong-headed some might judge the policies or how harsh or unfair some might perceive the criticisms to be. Nor are we debating the policies and practices of various Arab states or groups or the reactions to them, however wrong-headed some may judge them or harsh or unfair some may perceive the criticisms to be. What we are discussing is racism. That is the perverse tendency to negatively stereotype a group and see all members of that group as being possessed of some certain innate traits and behavior that are peculiar to them. For several reasons, this type of bigotry against Jews has become unacceptable, as I said. One was the collective memory of the Holocaust. It looms large in our culture, as it ought to be. Then there's the fact that we've developed a familiarity with the rich diversity of the Jewish community and are aware of the many contributions that Jews have made to our common heritage. Images of Jews of all types are present in our popular culture. Finally, there's the reality that the Jewish community and its organizations, with many allies across the religious, ethnic, and political spectrum, have made it clear that there is a price to pay for public manifestations of bigotry. It has not gone away, to be sure, but rather the proponents of this anti-Semitism have become marginalized and gone underground. This is sadly not the case with regard to bigotry directed against Arabs and Muslims. Despite some advances by Arab and Muslim organizations and their allies in many communities, and despite the strong statements by several political leaders, the bigotry persists. Arabs and Muslims are still seen as more violent, less humane, not sharing our values, less rational, more prone to anger, less trustworthy than the rest of us. And these notions are fueled daily by our popular and our political cultures. As Jack Shaheen so forcefully documents, Hollywood has an Arab and Muslim problem. And it's important because since our educational system is so deficient in teaching about the Arab world and Islam, popular culture is where most Americans get their information and form their ideas. Our political culture is no better, but with a distinct partisan twist. For more than a decade now, elements within the Republican Party have been engaged in a poisonous discourse directed against Muslims. They've made it a wedge issue in several election campaigns, culminating in recent years in the mass, almost hysterical movement to block the building of an Islamic community center in Lower Manhattan. And that spread to other communities where efforts were made to block the building of mosques. There's been a rash of referenda and legislation to block the imposition of Sharia law in over 24 states, and no one was proposing Sharia law in the first place. And there were declarations by legitimate major presidential candidates that they would insist that Muslims would have to take a special loyalty oath before allowing them into public service. And it has been revealed that on the highest level, our law enforcement agencies and our military have received and continue to receive deeply flawed and biased training about Arabs and Muslims in ways that could only be described as racist. The resultant hysteria has had an impact on the partisan divide, as I said. You look at the numbers, and they're all available on our website, aaiusa.org. Attitudes towards Muslims, for example, among Democrats, 55 favorable, 35 unfavorable. Among Republicans, in the last one we did, 12% favorable, 85% unfavorable. Are Muslims more violent than we? The same split. Are Muslims taught to believe in hate? The same split. Why do Arabs dislike us? 60+% because they hate our values, but when we poll in the Arab world, 80+% like our values. And the impact of this hate has had a devastating consequence on the Arab and Muslim communities. In hate crimes, in discrimination, in profiling. And the purveyors of this hate have received nary a slap on the wrist. Racist books like Raphael Bataille's The Arab Mind continue to be used and reissued by our military. They trained our military all the way through to the end of the Iraq War. Hate mongers like Michael Savage and Ann Coulter stay on the air and have strong, almost cult-like followings. Obsessed anti-Arab and anti-Muslim bigots, writers and bloggers like Pam Geller and Robert Spencer and Steve Emerson and Daniel Pipes are quoted by presidential candidates. They teach our law enforcement agencies, and they influence hate criminals. I know it from experience. Of the 3 men who went to jail after 9/11 for threatening my life, 2 of them were regular followers of their blogs, and frequently forwarded to me articles and commentary that they put on those blog sites. Before dismissing that there's a double standard at work in all of this, I ask you to take the simple test that a mentor of mine, former Senator James Averest, once taught me. Take what any of the above individuals have done and substitute Jew for Arab and ask yourself, what would the reaction be? If an Arab American wrote a book about Jews like the one that Spencer wrote or Emerson wrote, what would we say about them? What would we call them? And would their books even have been published by major publishing houses? If an Arab billionaire had distributed millions of copies of movies charging that there was a massive and violent Jewish conspiracy to take over the West, would presidential candidates be lining their campaign coffers with his millions as they are with Sheldon Adelson? And could anything like the Peter King hearings have happened about any other group other than Muslims? Need I go on? No. The bottom line is that it's a shameful double standard, and it must end. I'm thankful to Ralph Nader for his courage in helping us recognize this fact and to creating the opportunity for this debate to take place.
Thank you, Mr. Sloyan. Ralph Nader, I want to thank you for putting together this event to expand public attention to anti-Semitism, for inviting me. I established the Louis V. Brandeis Center to combat campus anti-Semitism, and so I appreciate when people are being more aware of the subject. I also accepted this invitation because I think the public needs to be more aware of anti-Arab discrimination, and so I'm glad for the people who are here, for the people who are watching, for what you've done, and for my fellow panelists. I'm going to try to address the broader themes. There were some individuals who've been mentioned in a particular way who can defend themselves, but I'd like to, instead of dealing with individuals, to deal with broader themes. I'd also like to say, though, for those of you who are here at Busboys and Poets, go for the mahi-mahi. I'm sure everything else is good. Mahi-mahi, excellent. Folks at home, you just will have to imagine. The question is framed in a little bit of a funny way when we're asked to talk about anti-Semitism against Arabs versus anti-Semitism against Jews. My first reaction, of course, is that there are no double standards comparing the two different forms of anti-Semitism, because in fact there's only one kind of anti-Semitism, which is discrimination against Jews. The term was actually coined in the 1870s in Germany for a particular reason, which is to say that Wilhelm Marr and others were concerned that their own views were being marginalized. Their own views were that they hated Jews, but they hated Jews on racial grounds rather than religious grounds. And they wanted a new term that would be a little bit more scientific and that would be less susceptible than words like Jew hatred to the notion that they were some kind of religious bigots, when in fact they were really more focused on racial issues. Historically, it's been used primarily in that way, and that's how I will use the term. Of course, we can use terms in different sorts of ways, and the bigger question, I suppose, is should we be taking anti-Arab discrimination and anti-Jewish discrimination very seriously? And I would argue that the answer to both questions is yes. I don't want to get into a kind of a persecution Olympics in which each group competes to see who can argue that their group has been faced with greater discrimination. To me, we need to do a better job as a society to combat discrimination against all groups, against Arabs and against Jews alike. There's been a lot of talk about the way in which Arabs have been mistreated in this country. We could agree or disagree about where you draw the line for either anti-Arab or anti-Jewish discrimination, but I think we need to stand together in combating both. It is interesting to hear this notion that as a society we have been more successful in combating discrimination against Jews, because it is my feeling that we need to do better against both, and because I have, as someone who deals quite a bit with anti-Semitism, I have heard quite frequently people underestimating the amount of anti-Semitism or belittling it or not responding in what I consider to be an appropriate way, and sometimes they even defend why they're doing that. And there are a couple of reasons why they will say we shouldn't be reacting firmly to anti-Semitism. One thing I hear, and I hear this a lot, is that Jews are doing just fine. Jews are economically successful, they're socially well established, we don't need to worry about Jews. Jews are wealthy anyhow. Well, there are lots of problems with this, but one thing that comes to mind is that just a few weeks ago, new data came out in New York City on the condition of Jewish Americans in New York. And what one finds is that 27% of Jewish Americans in New York live in poor households. That figure is slightly lower than for non-Jewish households, but it is a non-negligible figure. So we have quite a number of poor Jewish Americans. That number seems to be increasing, and it is a problem. But beyond that, it shouldn't matter if you're rich or poor. If you're subjected to any form of bigotry, we should be taking it seriously. And sad to say, despite the progress that we've made against anti-Semitism and racism over the years, there is still a rather significant amount of bias, bigotry, discrimination, and even hate crimes against Jews. I would say that we're doing better in the United States than anywhere else in the world. And I would say there's been no better time to be a Jewish American than today. And yet, there are many hundreds of Americans every year who, as Jews, face hate crimes. In fact, last year, according to FBI data, the most recent data, the number of hate crimes against Jews exceeds hate crimes against all other religious groups. It also exceeds the number of hate crimes against all ethnic groups. The point is not that problems are worse for Jewish Americans than from others, but that when people say that we have succeeded in dealing with anti-Semitism, or that we're responding firmly enough, or that we don't need to worry about it, the facts are against. Now, I've mentioned that my focus lately with the Louis D. Brandeis Center has been on campus anti-Semitism. Now, that's the place where one would expect to find the least amount of intolerance. After all, universities are supposed to be places of reason and tolerance, and yet one finds there, not in every campus and not affecting every Jewish student, but a disturbing number of incidents, whether we're talking about vandalism, whether we're talking about threats, whether we're talking about actual assaults or violence around the country. And that's something that needs to be defeated. So I would say, in terms of this comparison, that we shouldn't be asking either which has it worse, nor should we be asking, we solve the problem for one group, how can we solve it for the other? Rather, we should recognize that discrimination is a problem, whatever the group is that's facing it. It's a problem for Jewish Americans, it's a problem for Arab Americans. And what we need to do is to work together and combat it wherever and whenever it occurs. Thank you.
My distinguished colleagues here at the head table, Ralph Nader, I appreciate your putting this together. There's a wonderful Arab proverb which goes something like this: by repetition, even a donkey learns. And that repetition really could have been used by Goebbels back in the 1930s. In the 1930s, Goebbels talked about propaganda, and he said the only way propaganda can be effective is if you take a few select images of a people and you repeat them over and over again. The same images. The question here today is that these same images of Arabs, Christians and Muslims, have been with us for more than a century, constantly repeated over and over again in every form of American popular culture. The TV Arab is the Hollywood Arab, is the comic book Arab, is the editorial cartoon Arab, is the news Arab, is the Arab up on the hill Arab. It does not deviate at all. And as a result of that, the influence of politics, media have a tendency to follow policy. It includes television commentators, all of the major networks, especially Fox, which sometimes follows policy, others doesn't, depends on who's in office. And then, of course, Hollywood itself. And so taken together, these three, government, the press, as well as Hollywood. We have, over the past 100 years, created the Arab boogeyman. The mythology of today, Kennedy said it best. Patrick, I want to thank you for referring to former President Kennedy. He talked about the myth being much more dangerous than the lie, because the myth was persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic. And what we have now, the mythology shorthand, Arab equal Muslim equal evil, enemy of. That is the reality. You can say anything you want about an Arab today, anywhere, to anyone, and get away with it. I'll give you one good example. I live on Hilton Head Island, very nice place, really quite comfortable. And every now and then when I'm with my friends, I just say, we should, wouldn't it be nice if we had more Arabs living here and had a mosque right next to the synagogue? And right away. And I'll just give you one other example. I stumbled into this, I've been on the internet for quite a while. The word Arab, I get to find a restaurant called Arab restaurant. The word cannot be used. We go to Jerusalem, we go to Alibaba, we go to the Arabian Nights, but not Arab. It is not part of it's simply unacceptable. We never refer to Arab nations as our friends. In my life, and I'm now, Jim Zogby called me an old man on the phone, talking about my age. Anyway, we found out is that, why are they always called moderates? Are moderates in the Arab world? I don't want to be anybody's moderate. I would hope I can be someone's friend. The difference between the right word and the almost right word, said Mark Twain, is the difference between lightning and the lightning bug. Now the question here, I want to get to the main question. If in fact Arabs, prejudice against Arabs, if we use the term anti-Semitism instead of anti-Arabism, I think the prejudice will evaporate over a period of time. I think if fellow Semites can unite in this, Jews and Arabs, and not necessarily take a claim on this phrase, but to use it to bring us together. And I think the only reason we're apart, we're not together, is because of the politics. It has nothing to do, I think, with interpersonal relationships. And I think that's extremely important. No one can deny the fact we are part of the Semitic race. No one can take away, Jim argued so well, the demonization of Jews, that took place in Nazi Germany and in Russia, or the demonization, the vicious demonization, particularly in editorial cartoons, that takes place against Arabs. I can only tell you that, and I want to refer you to New York University. I'm now a distinguished visiting scholar at NYU, and they've taken on my collection of over 4,000 artifacts, everything from editorial cartoons to movies, to comic books, to toys and games. And if you go to NYU, look up the Shaheen archive, you'll see how history over the years has really demonized all things Arab. And I would hope that this afternoon, this is not a debate. I don't see it as a debate. I see it as a discussion, whereas as American citizens, we try to work together so that we can erase this hate that has been for so long injuring our people. And for that, I ask your assistance and the assistance of my distinguished colleagues here at the head table.
Very much for Ralph Nader and all the others that are behind this session for inviting me. I'm a little bit different than the other two. I'm not an American citizen, an Israeli citizen, so therefore don't look at me as a representative of Jewish Americans. I'm not. There's any journalist here. Also, I'm in a very tolerant mood because I heard that one of the sponsoring groups are pink coat, so I immediately ran and bought a pink tie. Remember it when you come to the Q&A. I came to the US in many times, but first time after 9/11, it was in November of 2001. and I landed in JFK. I went to LaGuardia in order to catch a flight to Atlanta. If you remember, an American Airlines plane just collided and about 150 or so people killed in Queens. It happened exactly when I was in the lobby of one of the terminals of LaGuardia, and I was standing next to a group of Muslim women that were there, and people looked at them with murderous looks. And I was shivering. I was shivering because I don't like murderous looks, being aimed at me many times, by the way, and I'll tell you about this. But I also thought, this is the problem. Now it's about Muslim women, tomorrow it will be about Tibetan monks, the day after it will be about Orthodox Jews under similar circumstances. So I say it because I totally agree with Jack's sentiment that why should there be a debate here? I mean, it's not a mutually exclusive situation whereby on a zero-sum game, where there are two Arabs and two Jews, they have to take immediately opposite position. On the question of discrimination and bigotry, we should be on one front. I just wondered why Arabs would like to be included under the cloud of anti-Semitism. What's so nice to be under this? I don't understand that. This is very Jewish to be self-tormenting, but why would it be very Arab to do that? I mean, anti-Semitism almost decimated my entire nation. And we are the only nation that could have been hundreds of millions. We are now only 15 million because of anti-Semitism. Thank God, Arabs are not in that situation. So this is my way of agreeing with Ken about the need to separate. I would like to make a few points here that may be a little bit different than others, and that's the advantage of being the last. One of the problems is, and I don't know how many American journalists are here that are still in active duty, is the ignorance that you get from all the American media about the Middle East. Arabs, about Muslims, about Jews, about Israelis, there is ignorance. How many of those people that talk about the Middle East know Arabic and Hebrew? How many of them? There's ignorance, but they do talk. How many of those who talk about Islamic or Jewish culture really know profound aspects of those cultures? They don't. And this ignorance is not about Arabs necessarily more than what is about Israelis or Jews or vice versa. Maybe more about Arabs, and if that's the case, I regret it. There's no ignorance. And as James said, by the way, we debated it here in 1988 and the both of us survived. You see, we are still here. So it shows that we can debate and be friendly, right?
I won, that's why.
Well, he brought 10 people in the entourage, so there was a 10-vote difference in his favor. Like, would you ever appear in a session hosted by Americans for Safe Israel and the American Science Organization? How I feel now here, but it's okay. But look, I say it because I'm watching from the sidelines in a way the discussion about the momentous events known as the Arab Spring or the Arab Awakening. And I find myself in a very interesting situation. All those journalists who never predicted anything like this are now knowing exactly what happened. And when you read about what they said to you, what was before and what is now, what will be, you see how ignorant many of them are. It doesn't matter whether they're pro or anti. It's just that this is a problem that we need to understand, and hopefully something will be done about it. And part of the problem is that we don't have enough of it in the academic community, which would be my second point. And we come then to Hollywood. The American academic community has a problem teaching the Middle East. It has a problem. I don't want to make it personal. I could. But there is a problem. The problem is that there is too much involvement of foreign money in Middle Eastern studies to the extent of making a lot of those studies unreliable, not serious, and unacademic. And because we are all in a friendly and tolerant and peaceful mood, I would not like to get into particular examples, but trust me that there is no need to do too much research to understand that a lot of the Middle East studies departments in America are being financed by foreign money with the aim of influencing public opinion. And in that case, I must say, that will be perhaps our first bone of contention here, a lot of it comes from the Arab side, much less so from the Jewish side. And we can give examples. I don't want to get into all that in terms of the exact figures, but it can be researched and be shown to be the case. We talked about Hollywood, and I know that Hollywood is somehow connected with the Jewish influence and all that. I don't know how many of you know that in 1945, right after the Holocaust, Dwight D. Eisenhower, later to become a president, invited 13 Hollywood executives and producers and whatever, all of them Jewish, to go to the concentration camps and death camps, I should say, and take pictures in order to create a movie. They refused to make a movie, all of them were Jewish. And I can make 2 points out of that, which one of them is very relevant to make what may be the Arab experience. One of the points is that we may have thought it wasn't a good subject to make a movie about. Okay, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Other point may be that those people bent over backwards at that time to put aside the Jewish identity in order to show how acceptable they are to the entire society and not to emphasize their distinctiveness from the rest of society. It may be that something like this happens among those who are in the Muslim community or the Arab community that are still not coming out forcefully and saying, this is our culture, this is our history, here it is something that we need to tell you, that we need to show to you, and we don't bend over backwards to take a distance from one day. It may be a question of generational gap. But then I come 60 years later to what is happening these days, and I find myself in a very interesting situation. I know that Jack Shaheen is a very modest person. By the way, we both are from South Carolina, so that could be the real coalition here against the Northeastern establishment,
That's us.
He was an advisor of a movie called The Kingdom about Saudi Arabia, right? And I don't know, somebody told me that you were.
Misinformation.
See? Typical Arab-Israeli discussion. But this movie is very interesting, and I want to make a point here. And the point here is, there were 50% of the people that watched it thought it was very much anti-Saudi Arabia because it might have shown some Saudi Arabians collaborating with terrorism or whatever it is that you call terrorism. 50% thought otherwise. That there were those Saudi Arabians who collaborate with the Americans against the terrorists, so that's fine, that's okay. But I ask you a question, and let's be honest about it. Do you perceive anything like a movie now in Hollywood about Saudi Arabia, forget about terrorism, about anything connected with religious bigotry in Saudi Arabia, with the treatment of women, with the fact that there can't be any memorial in Mecca for all those Jews who were destroyed there in the beginning of the Islamic history, or any of those? I don't think there can be a movie like that. And I'll tell you why, because there is a trend now, and that may be my other controversial point here, there is a trend now to create some kind of affirmative action in terms of, yes, we were anti-Arab, and it was the case, we were anti-Muslim, but now we are going all the way to the other side to show some kind of objectivity. And that is also wrong because there can't be affirmative action in terms of telling the truth about what's happening. Whether the truth is this or that, it's either the other. But telling the truth cannot be camouflaged under any title of affirmative action of one kind or another. And to end up with, I would say to you that many of my friends said, are you crazy going to this place with all those sponsoring groups and all that? And I said, look, it's great for me that I go to this place because now people in Israel will say, look, it's not that bad after all. Those guys are against him and he's still appearing there, it can't be that bad. Now, it's not funny, because that's how it became the debate between Israelis and Arabs, or Jews and Arabs altogether, that you cannot even come to a dialogue. I'm really happy to be here. I think it's going to be a great dialogue and discussion, and thank you very much again for inviting me.